Over the past couple of years, South Africa has seen a dramatic increase in protests ranging from service delivery, protests in universities and colleges, as well as racism in schools. Now, South Africa is dubbed the protest capital of the world with an average of 2.25 protests daily. That's a whopping 825 protests annually. To help us unpack the discussion today, we're asking the question, does protest culture serve as a viable tool in holding government and other institutions to account, or does it just result in rampant criminality? To add your thoughts to the discussion we're having today, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms. And in particular, be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Mountaintop Productions to add your thoughts. To give us a clearer perspective on what we're discussing today, take a look at the following insert. 1994 brought the dawn of democracy to South Africa. The nation had finally shaken off its dark history. Unity, newfound hope, and the spirit of the rainbow were the order of the day. Rich or poor, black or white, we were all sisters and brothers united for one common cause, to build this new South Africa. But then, the rainbow lost its luster. The country's ugly history of protests began rearing its head again. Service delivery, labor issues, and land distribution, which is some of the issues that were driving South Africans to hit the streets marching. Now, as much as protest can be seen as a healthy democracy at play, the waters get murky when property is damaged, lives are lost, and society finds itself in a worse off position than before. The July protest that saw rampant looting is said to cost the country about 50 billion rands. The Fees Must Fall protests are to cost the country 800 million rand, and these are just two examples of the economic cost of protests. Andries Tatane, Mgcineni Noki, also known as the man in the green blanket, Mthokozisi Ntumba, Benjamin Phehla, all lives lost at the expense of protests. Now, with this in mind, we ask the question, is protest culture an efficient tool used to hold power accountable, or does it simply fuel criminal elements? Now, to help us unpack more on the day's discussion, we're joined by four amazing panelists from different walks of life. We'll be sharing some of their insights, opinions, and truths with us. We're joined by Cairo Maroka from the Soweto Parliament. Cairo, how are you feeling?
I'm fine, thanks. And how are you doing, sir?
I'm good. Now, just tell us a bit about the work that you do at the Soweto Parliament. I understand that you are custodians and protectors of the people of Soweto.
Yes, we are. In a nutshell, we hold people accountable. That's what we do. That's what Soweto Parliament represents. We hold people accountable. We make sure that the people that are placed in a particular position to do the job, that they actually do it. Because for a very long time, people have just been skating by.
We'll see if we skate past this discussion today. We also have Nhlanhla Lux, president of the Soweto Parliament. Now, Nhlanhla, you were very instrumental in some of the very recent protests that we saw in the country. What informs your activism and the work that you do?
Accountability. At the center of everything we do is accountability.
Yeah.
So today's discussion is going to be interesting because we happen to be on the ground at the center of what's been happening recently in South Africa. So we'll unpack the truth as it is without being emotional about it.
We'll unpack the truth without any emotions. Anisa Mazimpaka, Season 6 winner of One Day Leader, 3-time University of Johannesburg alumni, and currently a master's candidate. Do you still feel as strongly about protest now as you did during Fees Must Fall?
I would say I'm still championing the agenda of social justice through education. And one of the tools that are used to do that is protest. In terms of being actively on the ground, I'm no longer actively on the ground, but as long as we are able to champion it through different channels, then yeah, we're still there.
Lesego More from the Democracy Works Foundation, a multidisciplinarian and a political activist. Lesego, do you believe that protest and protest culture in South Africa is any different from how it used to be back in the day when we were fighting for liberation and looking to advance issues such as the democratic dispensation?
Thank you for having me, Sydney. Thank you for inviting me. Most certainly, there are still a lot of similarities in what protest culture is today in South Africa as compared to the days where the apartheid government was being fought. And the most common of these similarities is the violent nature in which South Africans conduct protests.
No, thank you so much. Getting straight to it, Nhlanhla, very recently we had some of the biggest protests that we've ever seen in the country, KZN being shut down, Gauteng being shut down, looting sprees galore. And you're one of the guys who was standing by with your community and saying that we're not going to allow this, we're going to take care of our infrastructure. Aren't you afraid that that divorces you from the realities of some of the people that you are protecting and speaking for?
No, because like I said, we're at the center we're on the ground. The people, if you're just speaking about looting, the people that were actually looting were not, the instigators were not from the community. But because the community is a poor community, they then take advantage of a mall that's been opened up to take a TV or whatever it is.
So there's a third party?
There's a third party all the time.
And
so the people that were shooting at us the first day, second day, with live rounds, are not from the community.
Do you agree with the statement that the protests are not based merely on people's sufferings, that there's a third wheel, a third party involved?
I do agree. There's always a third force whenever it comes to protests, because you have to remember that when a group of people come together, they have a different agenda, right? A majority of the people would have the same common agenda, but unfortunately criminality finds itself within that surrounding. And I think that's when Nhlanhla is saying that, some people are not even from the community, they become the instigators. And I think one issue is how the protests are covered, the media, what are they focusing on? Because a lot of times they focus on the looting as opposed to the genuine cause of why the people are there. So we also need to guard against that.
So my concern is every time there's a protest in the country, Cairo, we always see these protests starting out as genuine protests where people are fighting for genuine causes, be it service delivery or access to education or whatever the case might be, but they always seem to trickle down to violence, to criminality, to looting, to damage of property. You'll think back to those taxi strikes that we saw when taxi drivers were fighting with the Uber drivers and how they were burning their cars and just damaging and destroying their property. Do you believe that protests sort of speak to what they're supposed to be speaking to, or are we just jumping on them to advance our own agendas?
I think a lot of people, just that the mind works differently. I think a lot of people jump on these things to advance their own agendas. They somehow lose what the protest was supposed to be all about. Maybe it's because the history of our country, this country was probably built on protest action. June 16, protest. Sharpeville Mass, protest. So there's always people that are trying to take advantage of the situation. That's how I see it. As a young person that's living in Soweto. That's on the ground, that sees these things every day. We see them building up, we see the community boiling up. Then there's other people that are just like, you know what, we've been talking to them, there's nothing else we can do. Let's just shut this whole thing down.
Now, Lesotho, I know that you're very passionate about community outreach, and in particular, community political outreach programs. We can't deny the fact that there are some goods that come with protesting. If you look all over the world, the civil rights movement in the United States, global climate change activists. What are your thoughts on the discussion? Do you believe that there's a genuine cause to protest, or do you believe that they are just promoting rampant criminality? And what are your thoughts in terms of some of the challenges that we see in our communities? What leads people to resort to protesting and finally resorting to changing those protests to making them what they end up being as?
Thank you, Sydney. I think it's important to draw an understanding of what protest is and what we understand it to be. Throughout the world, like you point out, protest is used as a tool to give a voice to the voiceless, as a tool to protect the voice of those who are disenfranchised in our society, that are excluded either socially or economically, through the use of protest throughout history. Like you point out, the civil rights movement, South Africa's own liberation, the Chile student movement, it's where the voiceless say that we want to speak out against our oppression. And protest, more importantly, is also a fundamental tool of democratic participation. We cannot only, Sydney, have healthy democracies where people only contribute during periods of elections to say that they hold government accountable. So protest is to say, in between these periods, we have a voice, we are dissatisfied, yes, we voted you in, yes, they are institutions, but like George Orwell says, Sydney, just because we live in a democracy doesn't mean that we are free from authoritarian rule. So protests are the tool that citizens are able to speak up, protect themselves, and obviously continue to fight for their rights and liberties.
Yeah, so then I beg to ask the question, and this is a question that I'm throwing out to the rest of the panelists. Here are protests in South Africa, common cause, people are fighting for whatever genuine cause it is that they're fighting for, but then we see the end result being the burning of schools, the burning of libraries, the burning of infrastructure, the burning of malls, countless job losses, the list goes on and on and on. Anissa, should we turn a blind eye when Sydney walks into a store and takes a $1,000 couch with him just because he is dissatisfied with the type of service he's getting from the country? Or is there any way in which we can divorce protests from those criminal elements that we're speaking about? Is it even correct to refer to them as criminal elements?
Sydney, I don't think it's possible to divorce protests and the element of criminality, because that element finds itself there. Do you understand? Once it becomes intertwined, that's where the narrative of the protest or the cause of protest changes, right? With regards to someone stealing a couch, that's pure criminality, right? But I wanted to pose a question maybe to the rest of the panelists. The unrests that we saw, people going into stores to steal food, I don't think that's an element of criminality, because in the first place, a person should not be in a position where they need to steal basic human, dignified, something that we should all have. So I don't think that's an aspect of criminality. I just feel like that is a result of our unequal society and the inequalities at play. We saw that in the July unrests, and it was very, very clear.
Let me put it to you, Cairo and Nhlanhla, based on the work that you were doing during those protests, and it's unfortunate that we're going to use those as a case study because they're so recent. Anissa argues that couch, not criminal. A can of baked beans or a can of tin fish, not criminal, right? But when you take a couch, then there's something definitely wrong with you. Do you agree with that narrative, or should we point out criminality exactly for what it is?
You know what, I understand exactly where she's coming from. The unfortunate part is that once we start defending criminality and starting to bracket it to say, this crime is better than this one, let's accept this one, not that one, we are then saying that we are undermining the constitution of this country, because the laws of this country must be respected by both foreign nationals and South Africans. As soon as we find room to start saying that, no, the laws here, let's just put this aside, we are honestly opening a door of criminal opportunity.
So we should call a spade a spade.
We must call it a spade soon. So what we should focus our energy on, to be honest with you, is holding government accountable. Because the lack of accountability in government is the result of the reality that we are faced with today.
Now, Lesego, Frans Fanon argues that violence begets violence, right? Do you think there's any way in which, in fact, do you think it's even fair to look at corruption in government post-1994 and, sort of like try to single out the challenges that are in government without necessarily looking at where this entire problem started in the first place, right? All of those years that people had to undergo in slavery, in abolition, in poverty, dejected to the townships, not having basic access to services, and now in the democratic dispensation when we think that things are going to be better, young people are still unemployed, we still have the highest rates of crime, we still have so many challenges that we're facing in our communities. Is there honestly any way to hold government accountable without blocking a street and denying basic services to get to where they need to get to? Is there any other avenue?
Thank you, Sydney. At times we place too much of a burden on the masses of our people. And the reason I say this is that many a times protest is the last resolute. The access that we on this panel have to institutions is not necessarily the access that all South Africans have. It's easy to reason when you can access these institutions, when you can go, when you've got the capacity to write a petition. But if you are sitting in a community with no water, which is a basic right that you need to live, with no electricity for you to cook for your children, how then must you be able to reason and say that I am not going to the streets? If time and time again it has proven that the only response that sometimes the ruling elite and the bureaucrats understand is that requires protest, that of showmanship where protesters say that it cannot be life as usual when we are not living life as usual. Like I say, protest in its nature is not a wrong thing, Sydney. It becomes a problem when protests become riots.
Sure.
Where now riots become defiance through the use of violence. Protests normally have a moral claim, Sydney. To say that we are ignored, we've been following these avenues. And the existence of institutions, parliament at the national level, not so into parliament, but parliament at the national level, legislatures, municipal buildings, the existence of those institutions that are supposed to be representative institutions do not necessarily translate into representation.
Sure.
So what is then to be done?
In this day and age, with the challenges that we're facing as a country, with the challenges that we're facing globally, is it still possible to have a protest that won't result in a riot?
We are ought to not get tired to educate members of our society, Sydney. Protests are not unique to South Africa alone. Developed as the United States is, they had a Let's Occupy Wall Street protest where they wanted to highlight income differences. The Arab Spring in North African countries, that all was informed by protests. So wherever there's government, there will be those in society that feel disenfranchised. So I think we should accept that protest will always be part of our democratic culture, but those who lead protests then bear a responsibility to say, South Africa is a country with an unemployment of 44%. If you target over 1,400 retail stores, what then are you hoping to achieve? Fees Must Fall is a good example, Sydney, where protests did yield a positive income.
And we'll talk about that positive outcome in just a minute. Let's go for a quick ad break.
After 28 man ophethe ama-28 general ama-28
lamadoda pay attention siyavuma phakamise i-general 8 la nganandoda uyaqanga seyiqoma i-general 8 udalani kuma kusenza ngibizona naso phezulani nanzo
ndimo khupha imela sentshonalanga zigcina ndimo yonke into yasentshonalanga igcina ndimo so zazinto zigcina ndimo umuntu kodwa azahlake imele zakuphuma phaa kum.
The entire prison institution is dominated by these so-called 26, 27, and 28 gangs. No matter which prison you visit in South Africa, you will always find these three gangs. They managed to endure the years and to this day maintain a tight network over vast lands and cities. These three gangs have forged a close relationship for power sharing against other gang domination. Since these gangs were established within prisons, a prison culture was inherited. A culture that fast became barbaric and made prisons notorious for violence and hostile behavior. These gangs then created a new prison language to safeguard their activities and protect their codes and secrets.
Welcome back. You're still watching Beyond the Truth. Now, before the ad break, we were discussing whether we believe if protest is still a viable tool to hold government and other institutions to account, or if protests just promote rampant criminality. Now, we can't continue the show, obviously, without sending a major shout out to our sponsors, the National Film and Video Foundation. Now, continue the discussion, and it's a very interesting thought I had while we were on break. You remember during the Fees Must Fall protest that I know you were very involved in during your time at university. One of the challenges that we see in protests is while others are protesting, others see an opportunity to advance and move ahead in terms of, their social status or in terms of their careers. Is that an honest assertion? Do you think that is the case, especially when we're speaking about those third parties or those instigators, someone who would start a protest just so that they could advance their political careers, taking advantage of people's desperations just for their own benefit and their own gain?
It is a correct analysis, if I were to be honest with you. And this is where the element of political opportunity comes into play, or the different reasons that protests take place,
Yeah.
One of the reasons is protests are a strategic tool. You can start a protest where there isn't, let's say, for example, a genuine struggle. And that is where you see the political opportunism, right? With fees must fall, I mean, we did see it where, you know, you now protest your way to the top. And unfortunately, it's a reality because while some people were getting locked up, you know, there were other deals that were being made in the background, whether it was by students, whether it was made by politicians who were using students, whether it was by a third force. But unfortunately, that's the reality, and not just in the Fees Must Fall protests, but in protests generally. You find that a genuine struggle is hijacked by an agenda that has nothing to do with the struggle.
Now, earlier on, you were making the distinction that, you know, there are people who are living in dire poverty, who are in need of items such as food, clothing, basic sanitation, and how we can't place those people with the guys that are taking a couch, for example. Do you honestly believe that, you know, their participation in protests such as those, their participation in, you know, those elements that you don't want us to refer to as criminal, do you believe that after taking items of need from a store, that in some way or the other changes their outcome?
Look, unfortunately, it does not change the outcome, right? But what it does change is these conversations we're having, which makes aware people who would otherwise turn a blind eye to these situations. Because most of the time we speak from a position of privilege, right? We don't want to understand why that person is taking something like a mere food, right? And I'm, for the lack of a better word, I'm happy with what happened in July, right? Because it opened the eyes of many South Africans to the challenges and the realities that people are actually facing. But one thing I want to touch on is the question of criminality that you, that's the highlight of this discussion, right? Black people in general are born, when you are born black, you are literally born a crime, right? Everything you do as a black person, not just in this country, but globally, Americans face the same issue. Everything you do, Sydney, is questioned. If a black person does, for example, if we had to look at these protests that have been taking place, right? Have a black person protest, you have the media reporting it differently. Have white people or other races protesting, you have it labeled differently. Look at the issue of people who were protesting COVID regulations in Cape Town at the beach. How were they treated by the police? The Senekal farmers who were protesting, look at what they did. They overturned a police vehicle. How were they treated? Look at people who protest for basic service delivery protests. Look at how they're treated. So even within these protests, there's an element, and there's always an element of racism. But most importantly, how is it policed? And that is the most important question, because it turns people who have a genuine cause into these so-called criminals. So instead of walking away with your service delivery issues being resolved, you're walking away with, unfortunately, a criminal record.
Very interesting assertion that Anissa is making, Nhlanhla. But Anissa also says that she's happy about the protest that she saw recently
I think
in the country.
I think what she's actually saying is that she's happy with the educational element of what happened. I don't think she's happy with 2,000 people per mall losing jobs. I don't think she's
Let's
happy
just find
about
out
that.
quickly, is that what you're saying?
I'm not happy about people losing their jobs
Sure.
in the malls,
Okay.
but we also have to be very clear about the fact that, about what we want to achieve, right? We don't just want people to have jobs, we want people to be part of the economy, right?
So there's this huge elephant in the room, right? Because we're talking about something, but we're not talking about something. We had an entire country almost burned to ashes not so long ago, right? There was a report, reports went out that former president is going to be arrested for a contempt of court case, and that he would be sentenced to, was it 3 months in prison, if I'm not mistaken? And that just sparked these wide protests that we saw all over the country. So the question that I beg to ask, Nhlanhla, as well as yourself, Kyron, maybe Lesotho, you can also throw in your thoughts. These challenges have always been there, right? So there's always been a challenge of poverty. There's always been this challenge of people not having access to basic needs. There's always been a problem of racism in South Africa. We've always had these challenges, and they've always somehow been swept under the carpet by the leadership that we have. Why is it that the arrest of former President Zuma was the tipping point? It just saw everything just go south.
Yeah, because I think of what most of our panelists have already said. She also said it strongly that a lot of people, especially in politics, take advantage of the true cause. If now we just be honest about it, when it started, it was about the former president, Jacob Zuma.
Yeah.
And where does economics or politics come into play? Because people are hijacking the true cause. The true cause is about the man. And the man being too old to go to. So we need to focus on that problem.
Yeah.
And discuss the problem for what it is. But we opened the door too wide. And everyone else, even my poverty situation, starts to play its role there. And even criminals. Say, and like I wanted the money because of Zuma, Runarka Shapa the ATM. Do you see what I mean? Because that's exactly what happened. When we were in the township, Go Maponya Mall, for example, what we were defending had nothing to do with Jacob Zuma.
Yeah.
The Maponya Mall was the last mall standing in Soweto. So if you understand what we're defending the gunshots that were playing behind our ears every 2 seconds. Like this can't be the norm. Because people accepted it as a norm. The cops accepted it as a norm. They were nowhere to be found. That's when we stepped in. We said, no. Our parents, the women and children can't live in this environment.
An interesting dynamic to what you're saying, during the looting and during the destruction of property. Now, I sensitize with the situations that our people find themselves in, right? Not having access to food, not having access to basic needs and basic services.
Sure.
But Cairo, maybe you can help me out here. I mean, we were looking at the East Rand and places such as Vosloorus, we're looking at Soweto, we're looking at places such as Everton and the Vaal, right? And in every single community, and I think this will also speak to how the media itself broadcast what's happening, right? What was the fuss about with alcohol?
And sorry to hijack Cairo.
Yeah.
Here's what's also important for us to understand. Everything that was centered around black economy, if it's even a reality, was looted. Sandton is 5 minutes from Alexandra. Was Sandton looted? Melrose Arc is even closer. Was it looted? Was there any chance of it being looted? No. But everything in the black community was looted. So when we start saying that, when you look at the agenda of we need to fix the economy and make sure that the black people are in,
also black businesses got affected in the process.
Sure.
Before we have this exchange, Cairo, this issue, right? ShopRite liquor, Pick and Pay liquor stores, bottle stores, it was such a frenzy, right? What is at the root of it, right? What is it that can take a cause as genuine as fighting for needs and basic services to tone it down and to strip it apart to such a point that we're now focusing on the beer of the day?
That one is very tricky to answer because we don't indulge in such substances. The problem is, I don't know if maybe the country was thirsty because we were coming from a level 4 lockdown. I think that's Sunday when people were looting.
Yeah.
The president announced another 21 days or something that he extended. So I don't know if the country is thirsty. I don't know. Is it maybe because of the alcohol consumption that we are so used to as a society? Maybe we need to be high, we need to be drunk.
It says a lot about,
lazy. So I don't understand
about the Model 5 of our country. Something definitely is wrong. Maybe we'll have that conversation in one of our episodes. Anissa, you were coming into what Unhlanhla was saying.
I just wanted to say that this speaks to, one, the systematic challenges that are engraved in this country, right? Two, the privilege that I spoke about. And three, the element of the third force, which is a good question. Why was Sandton quiet? Why was Melrose quiet? Why is it only the so-called black, why were they also being attacked? I mean, and if we question this, we see it for the bigger picture and not just as we saw it unfold. And of course, I don't agree with the criminal elements, the gunshots, people being endangered. Arrest those people who are doing that, But as for the people who are taking, mere things like, baked beans and stuff, why are they going to jail for that?
I mean, we saw almost more than 2,000-3,000 people getting arrested without, I think it was only a few days once they had been incarcerated that there were conversations about bail. And there were so many, and there was such a huge backlog, Lesego. But we still beg to ask the question, is protest culture and all the discussions that we've been having, right? When you look at the challenges that we face in our communities, when you look at how people are unable to just get by, young people facing high rates of unemployment, is protest action a sustainable tool, right? Protest in itself. Can we still look at it in the 21st century as a sustainable tool to hold our government to account? Is there any other option that a desperate, dejected, poverty-ridden black majority in South Africa have? Apart from that option of taking to the streets and closing them down, no one is going to work, no one is going to school, and if needs be, we'll burn a library just to prove a point. Is there any other alternative to get government to really listen to the people? And I think with what you're saying, we'll also get to the discussion around the work that you guys do with the Soweto Parliament and whether it has been effective in getting ESCOM and all these other state institutions to account. But I don't know, your thoughts on that, Lesego?
Sydney, they say that each democratic society gets the government that it deserves. Yes, protest is only one of the tools to hold government accountable, but elections still remain the most powerful tool to change the status quo that we have. South Africa is a society that has created a state of nihilism. And what I mean by this is that people see no worth in their lives anymore because of the way the socio-economic conditions are. We are a society that is always ripe for a protest. We are constantly at a tipping point. That's why it started as a release Zuma protest and it spiraled down to something else. And yourself and Anissa raise an important matter that those who control media and the narrative as well are also culprits. Because the Senegal protests, how many people were arrested? Why is it that when it's black bodies that protest, we can arrest people? In 2017, we had a big Zuma must fall protest where Tshwane was closed. Tshwane was shut down. A lot of political parties shut down Tshwane. Till today, nobody wants to speak about the economic impact of that protest. But when protests drive a certain political agenda, they are made to seem as though they are unprogressive. And therefore, I put to you, Sydney, that there is a reason why progressive democracies in the world protect protest as a socio-political right. Protest is an important part of our society. However, the manner in which it is done, the third hand, the third force, the burning, the looting, should never be condemned. But protest remains an important tool for those who are disenfranchised.
Nhlanhla Cairo, Lesego makes a very interesting point that, you know, protests, although they serve as a viable tool, there's also elections, which most times than not, especially young people in the country, seem to take for granted. Do you believe that a change of regime is what South Africa needs, a change of political leadership?
We need young people to lead this country. We can't continue to have old people taking decisions for a future that they will not be a part of. And that's why they make the wrong decisions all the time. We need young people. Here are young people, very smart, very able to lead this country. Not just departments, I'm talking about the entire country. So we need to give young people a chance because young people will be there tomorrow to account.
Cairo, who are these young people going to be? Because we won't be young forever, we'll be waiting in line till the coming of
these young people, as the time goes by, they'll spring up. Definitely sure they'll spring up.
No, we're not short of young people.
There's a lot that we can take from places where we live in. There's a lot. There's a lot of young people that will take this country forward.
We're not saying high school young people. We're saying young people. Someone who's 38 is young. So we have a lot of young people.
We find so many different bodies, so many different structures, young political organizations, student activist movements. The list is endless. Great young leaders who could have sprung up and could have become, and I'm talking about when we were still students and when we were still participating in Fees Must Fall movements and in various other movements at the time. And we sort of see that leadership just trickle down almost to nothing without them being given a voice and an active chance to propel and to be moved ahead. What is needed to get the leadership to listen to that cry and to listen to that voice and to get these young people or future leaders of the country to really see that what's happening in the country currently cannot continue like that?
I think, Sydney, we need to be really honest with ourselves as young people. When I spoke about the politicians or the senior politicians using students to advance their political ambitions. That's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, we can get young people, but what happens when those young people become an extension of these people we do not want in power? And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Because in order for me, for example, or let me not say me before it's misunderstood or misconstrued, in order for someone, part of a student movement, to advance their political career, right?
Yeah.
They needed, for example, for the lack of a better word, a handler, right? Which means that they are now, you know, they're being used to advance that gain, right? So what's the difference if I replace a young person with the narrative or the ideology of the older person? So that's why I'm saying we need to be honest with ourselves.
So you're taking an old brain and putting it in a new head.
Definitely. And I agree with Nhlanhla. We do need young people, but we need to have these honest conversations where we unite beyond political lines and we are serious with what we want. Because like Nhlanhla said, we're going to inherit this country. The decisions that older politicians are making, what, 2050 vision, some of them are not even going to be there. But we are going to be here to live to what they have promised. And most of the time, it's not what we need.
Oh, we've been having a very fruitful discussion. From rampant criminality was a viable tool to having handlers and possibly having an old brain in a new head. We'll be back with more after the break.
After 28 ndiyimana ophethe ama-28 general ama-28
la madoda pay attention siyavuma aphakamisa i-general aid la ngani nandoda uyaqangatha iqoma i-general aid udalani kuma kusenza ngibizona naso phezulani nanzo
ndim okhupha imela sentshonalanga zigcina ndim yonke into yasentshonalanga igcina ndim so ezaa zinto zigcinwa ndim umntu kodwa zahlatywa imela zakuphuma phaa kum.
The entire prison institution is dominated by these so-called 26, 27, and 28 gangs. No matter which prison you visit in South Africa, you will always find these three gangs. They managed to endure the years and to this day maintain a tight network over vast lands and cities. These three gangs have forged a close relationship for power sharing against other gang domination. Since these gangs were established within prisons, a prison culture was inherited. A culture that fast became barbaric and made prisons notorious for violence and hostile behavior. These gangs then created a new prison language to safeguard their activities and protect their codes and secrets.
Welcome back. You're still watching Beyond the Truth. Now, today we've had some very interesting conversations from our panelists, ranging from why protests happen, what our people go through, and why there's a need to get our people educated about the different types of protests and what they can do to have their voices heard. I would have loved for us to have more conversations about protest culture in the country, from the taxi industry to our media to so many other different aspects and avenues. It's just unfortunate. Now, as we draw towards a close, I just want to get final feelings and final remarks. And I think I'll start off this time around with you, Lesego. Based on the work that you do, and based on what you've seen over the years from a student activist point of view to a young career man and a young academic, do you feel that that change you spoke about, that people have in the palm of their hands, on the voting ballot or on the ballot paper, do you feel that enough consciousness is being raised to make them aware of what they can do to stop being on that tipping point?
Thank you so much, Sydney. Definitely not. There is a need to create greater consciousness. There is a need for civic education, Sydney. A lot of the work that we do, especially the projects that I work on, involve going to rural communities. And when you speak to rural communities about if you're having service delivery issues, did you know that you can speak to the provincial legislature, for example? They don't even know of such an institution, what the mandate of that institution is. what the mandate of their own ward councillor is, for example. So like I say, for these institutions to bear results, for these vehicles that are there, for us to have an operational and functional democracy, we need to invest more in educating our society. And we could obviously also start looking at conversations like, do we start educating children at the school level about civic rights? The mandate of the IEC, is it just to preside over elections and drive voter awareness? What else are you doing in between those periods of elections? So there is a serious need to educate, and most importantly to preserve this precious democracy that people have fought so hard to attain.
Education at the heart of our democracy. Thank you so much for those words, Lesejo. Anissa, now we've spoken extensively about protest culture, how we should look at one as criminal and how we should not look at the other one as criminal. Based on your experience, you've done One Day Leader, you've been a student activist, you've been an academic. How can we go about, in this day and age, continue championing that social justice, even if it's not just through education, right? But that popular slogan that you keep mentioning around social justice, to avoid situations where we end up being used as a stepping stone for those who want to advance their own careers.
Again, social justice through education does not look at the mainstream education. It speaks about educating yourself about what you're saying. Find out, before you enter the political space, analyze the space. How does the political space work? So yeah, Sydney, we just need that whole social justice through education vibe. We need to be aware of what our vision is and not allow ourselves to be used. Like I said, young people need to unite for a genuine cause beyond political lines, because when I was a student activist, when we first started, it was a thing of, okay, don't engage with certain political parties. And I think for the first year, you kind of were scared to engage, my apologies, with the opposition. And then you get to understand that it's not about the party lines, but the genuine cause. Hence, I'm saying unite beyond the political lines. And young people really, really need to do that as a sense of urgency if we really want that change.
With elections coming up, I hope we'll be able to see that unity. But thank you so much for the work that you do and for agreeing to be part of today's panel. You were the only rose among the very many thorns, and we appreciate your presence.
Thank you for having me.
Thankfully, none of these guys were able to intimidate you. They wouldn't dare. Cairo, the work that you guys do at the Soweto Parliament, is there any way that we'll see a growth of the Soweto Parliament becoming the Gauteng Parliament, or going beyond just Soweto?
To answer that question, yes, very much so. We always tell young people outside of Soweto one thing, that if they see a problem, they need to rise. We need leaders that won't be bought. We need leaders that won't be sold. We don't want leaders that get e-wallets there. We don't want leaders that make manifestos, go Cubana, go Capello. We don't want leaders misusing funds, go Konka. Sorry to mention these places, not that it's a bad thing, but we need leaders to stand up. It's about time we take this country forward. This is our country after all. We have nowhere else to go except where we are now. We can't run away from all of this. This is our country. If you have a problem outside of Soweto, Davidton Parliament. You have a problem, Auckland Park Parliament. We're going national. I
completely agree with you. We need to see more. We need to see more of that fighting spirit that our current leaders who were former activists used to have back in the day.
Yes, true.
We need to revive that spirit, definitely. Quite an interesting question I have for you specifically, Ndlante. Given the work that you guys were doing as the Soweto Parliament, especially with the protection of, during these very recent protests, the protection of malls, and, reminding the people of Soweto why it is important to reclaim and continue maintaining sustainably your community. Did you perhaps in any way come under fire? Were you being seen as an anti-revolutionary, denying people the right to walk in and take their plasma screens?
Yes, big time. But we stood our ground firm, because at the center of what we're doing, if you actually analyze properly what we're doing, we're unifying youth outside politics to come together. The only reason why we had so much aggressive traction from politics is because our voices are not coming from ANC Youth League or EFF Youth League. We're just ordinary people of the community with a stronger voice than politicians and the young politicians. And that's the only reason why we got so much smack out of the entire process. Who has a strong voice amongst the young people in politics? You have to think hard about it. We discussed it just now during the ad break. But now you are seeing not just Bobo Lux, Wentlanta Lux from Soweto, but if you think of a name, a young person's name, that person is outside politics. That already shows you that there is a strong movement that is rising outside politics. And I agree with her when she says that we need to unite outside politics to take this country forward, because politics is the vehicle that divides us as young people. Because as soon as you say you're from this party or that party, I don't agree with you. Because, and another thing that's very important, as soon as I start subscribing to politics as Ntlantla Lux, my independent thinking is going to be lost. I'm going to have to be forced to start thinking as per the organization's thinking.
To start taking up a new and different
and I wouldn't allow that for myself personally.
Very interesting views, very interesting conversations, very interesting inputs from very amazing panelists. That's it from us today here on Beyond the Truth. Thank you so much to you, our viewer, for tuning in. Thank you so much as well to our sponsor, the National Film and Video Foundation, for assisting us in continuing the work that we're doing here. Do remember to subscribe, like, and comment on our YouTube channel at Mountaintop Productions, and also remember to follow Mountaintop Productions on all social media platforms. That's it from us today on the show. Be sure to catch us next time on Beyond the Truth, where we go beyond the truth.